Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about Goa Civil Code and how it deals with matters of inheritance and property rights. We also talk about the Rajasthan government cancelling the student union polls. But first, we talk about new guidelines for doctors. Last week, the National Medical Commission, which is the country's top medical regulator, came out with a new set of guidelines. A 60-page document that includes instructions on how doctors should professionally conduct themselves. And among them, there is a guideline that doctors have been protesting against. In fact, the Indian Medical Association, the largest body of doctors in the country, said in a statement that this guideline was like running trains without tracks. When we spoke to Indian Express's Anonna Dutt, she told us that this guideline is regarding how doctors should write prescriptions.
And it says that you have to write the name of the chemical salt that is used in a medicine. So for example, a paracetamol instead of saying Dolo to a patient, so that you're not sort of favoring a brand. That is the idea behind this notification.
So doctors should only use generic names of medicines on the prescription instead of a particular brand. And before we go ahead, it's important for us to properly understand what a generic medicine is.
A generic medicine is basically a medicine which has the same chemical compound as a branded version of the drug. So, for example, if a Johnson & Johnson comes out with a bedaquiline, which is used for the treatment of drug-resistant TB, a generic version would have the same active ingredient but manufactured by other companies. And then there can be two types of generics, branded generics and generic medicines. Branded generics would be, say, another company, a Sun Pharma or Cipla, manufacturing the same medicine, but they write their brand name on it after the patent on the drug is over. So that would be a branded generic, and a generic would just contain the name of a particular drug in bold, and it will not have any branding.
And these kind of medicines tend to be a lot cheaper, like Anonna mentioned. But they're also much harder to find. Not every pharmacy stocks them. But this is not the only reason why doctors are protesting against this move. So in this segment, we find out from Anonna the other major reasons behind it. Anonna, at the outset, like you said, it might seem that this is a fair thing to do, that it would mean that no doctor can favor or be influenced by any particular brand or pharmaceutical company. So why is it that doctors are protesting against this guideline?
So one of the major reasons that has led to the protest is the variation in quality of drugs. So if, say, a drug is produced by Johnson & Johnson or GSK, there are certain guidelines that they follow which ensure that the end product is of the same quality, each batch. And doctors trust this. So if they have been prescribing a particular brand of medicine and they see that it works for their patient, then they're likely to continue prescribing that brand. They also sometimes, determine how long the dosage has to be taken, or, what is the exact dosage that needs to be given, depending on which brand of medicine that they're prescribing. So that is one of the reasons. And problem with generic versions of the same drug is that, of course, it will be the same chemical composition, but the quality can still vary, because if the proper good manufacturing practices are not followed, there could be less active ingredient in a tablet, say, or there could be a problem with the dissolving of the tablet, which can again lead to less active ingredient in your body, or there could be some impurity that can come in. So there are various things, and this varies from company to company, and which is why a lot of doctors would prefer a specific brand.
And what do you think this move means for patients, people who will end up buying the medicines?
So this is tricky. Because yes, we want on the one hand for the medicines that we consume to be cheaper, and that's what the government is trying to do under their Jan Aushadhi Kendra mission. But the problem is, if they start writing the generic names, if they say paracetamol, I can go to a store and they might not have a generic paracetamol brand. That's because most neighborhood stores would not stock it. It does not have a good profit margin. It's just not available. So either I have to go shop to shop just to find a paracetamol, which would, even a branded version, probably cost me rupees 10. But I have to go to find a paracetamol and not say a Dolo or Calpol or something. And secondly, if there is substitution, which means that any medicine which contains paracetamol, they can give me any medicine. But then the choice is now with the pharmacist instead of the doctor. So the doctor might think one antibiotic is good and prescribe that to you. But now since they can't write the brand name, you have to depend on whatever the pharmacist gives you. And again, I wouldn't say all pharmacies are bad, but they would try to keep medicines that have a better profit margin than, looking at the quality of the medicine.
And Anonna, this concern that doctors are raising also speaks to the lack of standardization in the country when it comes to medicines. Could you also talk about that aspect a bit?
So now there is actually a great push from the government to standardize everything, because India has been positioning itself as the, a hub of generic medicines. So they do want that we just manufacture quality medicines. So now the government has taken a couple of steps. So the first was doing a risk-based assessment. They, according to risks, they examined some 162 manufacturing units in the country, and they found a lot of violation of these good manufacturing practices there. Like, some companies not testing the incoming raw material, or, not conducting certain quality control checks during the process, not maintaining proper documentation, or not having the proper segregated infrastructure for different processes. So they found a lot of lapses in the good manufacturing practices, and then said that the companies should start implementing the global level good manufacturing practices, a draft guideline for which had been issued in 2018. But now the government has said that within 6 months to a year, all companies should implement this, so that there is a uniformity of quality across all manufacturing plants in India.
Also, when we talk about this guideline, does it mention any exceptions, medicines for which doctors can mention brands?
So there are a couple of exceptions. They have given exceptions for drugs which have a narrow therapeutic index, which basically means that even a slight change in the concentration in the blood can drastically change the outcome for the patient. So in such cases, the doctors can prescribe whichever brand they want to stick to. Or in the case of biosimilars are basically sort of like the generic version of drugs that are manufactured using some living organisms. So, for example, a bacterial culture or something is needed to manufacture these drugs. So, a generic version of that would be known as biosimilar. So, in that case as well, the doctors can prescribe particular brands. And it does say that, these exceptional cases, there can be a leeway for these, but these are the two specific examples that the guidelines cite.
And what would happen if a doctor refuses to follow this particular guideline? Could action be taken against them?
So I'm not sure that the government would initiate action at the moment, because the doctors, especially the IMA, has written to the health ministry, asking them to keep this in abeyance till there's a stakeholder consultation and there is a discussion on how to best implement this guideline. But if they wanted to, they could take action against the doctor, because now not prescribing the generic drug would constitute a professional misconduct for the doctor, which can result in punishments like their name getting stricken from the medical register, which would mean that they cannot practice medicine for however long the name is suspended, or they could be asked to pay a fine, which the guidelines make provision for.
And next we talk about the Uniform Civil Code, or UCC, the idea that there should be one single law that should decide how personal matters like marriage, divorce, inheritance or adoption are governed, regardless of someone's religion. Now, previously on the podcast, we have talked about how the BJP-led government is unlikely to push for the UCC in its current term. But according to party officials, it does plan to keep the issue alive in the run-up to the 2024 elections. And the thing is that whenever the Uniform Civil Code is talked about, Goa inevitably comes up because it is the only state with a Uniform Civil Code. Goans, even now, have to defer to the Portuguese Civil Code for personal matters.
So when Goa was liberated from the Portuguese rule in 1961, the state chose to retain personal laws and, in fact, a lot of other laws as well, which they had inherited from the Portuguese.
That's Indian Express's Apurva Vishwanath, who reports on law for the paper.
It made sense perhaps because it would give some continuity for people. And over time, Indian laws were extended to Goa, and wherever there is an Indian law that is in conflict with the Portuguese law, the Indian law would be applied. So that's the formula that was adapted in 1961. So the Civil Code, which is inherently what governs marriage, property rights, divorce, these things for Goans continue to be under the Portuguese Civil Code.
And so in this segment, we take a look at the Portuguese Civil Code and talk about its main features. Apurva, with the Uniform Civil Code, the idea is that personal laws should be the same for people of all religions, and many argue should be based on gender equality. Does the Portuguese Civil Code align with that kind of vision?
In the 19th century, when Portugal was developing a code, one code that encompasses every law for all its people, right? They were applying this code to a Christian majority colony in India, which was Goa. So if you look at the code, there is a heavy dominance of Catholic religion in the code. But for other, what the code calls gentile natives, which is the local population in Goa at that time, which is upper caste Hindus, some Muslims, but very few Muslims, but a few upper caste Hindus, this code extends to them as well. But for the Hindus, which at that time would have been, merchants who were wealthy, they get some benefits or special concessions under the law. But largely, it is a law framed for a Catholic majority Goa back in the day. But now, anybody who's a Goan, and that definition is very important, it's defined in the law. Anybody whose parents or grandparents were born in Goa before the liberation happened. So that number is, of course, dwindling now with more people moving out of the country, giving up the Indian passport. That number is shrinking, and we don't know how many exactly are still governed under this law, how many continue to be called Goans as per the legal definition. But it is only for them that the code applies. So today, if you move to Goa, started living there, the Portuguese code won't apply to you, of course.
And Apurva, so talk about how the Portuguese Civil Code is applied to personal matters. What does it say about inheritance and property rights, for example?
So when it comes to personal laws, I think the most radical idea for India in 1861 is the communion of assets, which is where Portugal basically says that once a man and a woman marry, all property that they have, it becomes a community property, which means it belongs to both of them. So suppose a woman came from a wealthy family and she married a husband, her husband would also be entitled to an equal share in her property. And this goes the other way too. Women also get an equal right in their husband's property. So communion of assets is something that was very prevalent in Europe back then. But for India, a very radical idea, because under Hindu law, even after marriage, the wife is a legal heir. Like she's entitled to some inheritance from her husband's property. But the husband is the karta or the main, person who manages the family. So, but here, this provision is seemingly equal, right? Like it gives the woman an equal share in the household property. And the other big difference that 1861 law had is that while inheriting property from your parents, a daughter and a son have an equal right to the property, which means in Muslim law, a daughter can only inherit half as much as a son inherits. Even in Hindu law, it wasn't always that women had an equal right to property. That came in through a series of amendments and introductions to the law, which now there is equality in inheritance. But in the Portuguese law in 1861 itself, the code is very clear that the daughters and the sons inherit equally.
So would you say that the level of gender equality present in the Portuguese Civil Code is significantly greater than the other personal laws in the country?
Yes. So when the children are inheriting, this gender neutrality is very significant. But when it comes to communion of assets, that is a tricky one because even Europe has moved on from that idea. Like even Portugal now has what they call a communion of marital property, which means only property that you have built during the marriage is where the wife and the husband have an equal share, are entitled to an equal share, but not with ancestral property. So if the wife has a certain inheritance, she doesn't have to share that with her husband, but whatever they built during the marriage, that is shared equally. So communion of assets now, like a legal expert in Goa, former Advocate General S.D. Lotlikar put it, communion of assets is a great idea, but it was meant for a time when marriages used to last and there was no concept of a divorce. Now, if couples are splitting up, splitting ancestral property of each other becomes very, very tricky.
And Apurva, right now the government is looking for a template for a uniform civil code. Based on your conversation with legal experts, could the Portuguese Civil Code be an option, or at least something we can take from?
So bringing in equality when it comes to inheritance between genders, that is a common thread. But the Goan law cannot be just a template that you can just copy paste for a larger population. Because at the end of the day, in Goa, about 7 to 8 lakh people, estimates say that that's how many people might be governed by this law. So adapting that to the whole country is not ideal. But what you can take from the Goan code is that this equality in inheritance across religions. So even a Muslim family or a Hindu family in Goa would have to pass on their property equally to children of both genders.
And in the end, we talk about Rajasthan. Earlier this month, the ruling Congress government in the state took a decision to cancel the upcoming student union elections. A decision that came as a complete shock to the NSUI, which is the student wing of the Congress party, and the ABVP, which is the student organization affiliated with the RSS. When we spoke to Indian Express's Deep Mukherjee, he told us about the series of events that led to this move.
So, order was issued on August 12th by the State Education Department, and rather coincidentally on that same day, Chief Minister Ashok Gehlot, while speaking with reporters, had expressed his concerns about violations of Lingdo committee recommendations and the way student union elections have become a show of money and muscle power by people.
The Lingdo committee that Deep mentions here had in 2005 made recommendations which included that a maximum of 5,000 rupees should be spent per candidate in student union elections. And in 2006, the Supreme Court had directed that these recommendations be implemented. Though over the years, several student organizations have been accused of not following them.
So on the same night, the order was issued by the Education Department, which said that the cancellation of the elections will not be held this year.
And Deep, could you give a sense to our listeners about the kind of role that student union elections play in state politics?
Yeah, so mostly the student union elections set the mood for the larger assembly elections, while it has been seen as a trend that most student union elections are won by independents or rebel candidates and not the ones who are given tickets by political parties. But it is true that some of the main leaders of the Rajasthan assembly today, be it the leader of opposition Rajendra Rathore or Congress Minister Pratap Singh Khachariawas, they have a history in student union elections. They have risen through the ranks after first testing their electoral mettle in the student union elections.
Okay, and what reasoning has the government given for cancelling these elections this year?
So in the order issued by the Education Department, it was mentioned that a meeting was held between the various vice chancellors of state-funded universities, and they were of the opinion that it is a challenge to implement all the constituents of the National Education Policy 2020. And there are also issues such as academic back-off credit registration of students, the implementation of the semester system and institutional development plan, and also to ensure the qualitative aspect as focused by NAC. So the vice chancellors, according to the order, were of the opinion that after seeing all these considerations, it is in the interest of the welfare of students that the student union elections in the current 2023-24 academic session are not held.
And what kind of reactions have we seen from these student organizations?
Yeah, so student outfits, irrespective of the political parties to which they are allied to, have expressed their outrage and opposition to this move of not holding the student elections this year. The ABVP is continuing to protest and holding dharnas. Interestingly, the NSUI, which is also allied to the Congress, has also expressed their unhappiness over this move with various NSUI leaders telling that they will request the government to reconsider the decision and allow the student union election results. So ever since the government has announced that the student union elections will not be held, the student outfits have been on protest mode. The Rajasthan University in Jaipur has become the epicenter of such protests. People have even climbed atop water tanks to protest, and police and administration officials have been constantly monitoring the situation, and more forces have been deployed within the university compound.
And we've also heard these organizations make allegations against the Ashok Gehlot government. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so while the NSUI has been objecting the move, it hasn't openly made any accusations against the government. But the ABVP at the same time, the ABVP has said that also the BJP, they have said that the government has done this because they had preempted that the NSUI, which is the student outfit of the Congress, will lose most of the elections.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.